Dred Scott v. Sandford was a landmark decision that helped change the entire history of the country. The Supreme Court decided the case in 1857, and with their judgment that the Missouri Compromise was void and that no African Americans were entitled to citizenship, hastened the Civil War, which ultimately led to freedom for the enslaved people of the United States. Dred Scott was born in Southampton, Virginia. He was actually born with the name of Sam, but was later known as Dred. He was born, raised, and grew into adulthood as a slave worker on the plantation of Peter and Elizabeth Blow. Of the 11 children born to Peter Blow, all were raised to treat slaves well and later refused to own slaves. Several of them, including Taylor, Henry, and Charlotte Blow, were instrumental in helping Dred and Harriet Scott pursue their later suit for freedom despite the Blows not owning Scott at the time. The Blow family had moved to St. Louis in 1830, taking Scott with them, and soon sold him due to family's financial problems. Dr. John Emerson, a military surgeon stationed at Jefferson Barracks, purchased Scott, and Scott accompanied him to posts in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery had been prohibited by the Missouri Compromise in 1820. On April 6, 1846, Dred Scott and his wife Harriet filed suit against Irene Emerson for their freedom. It is not known for sure why he chose this particular time for the suit. Scott had lived in free territories and had the standing to legally challenge his enslavement. Historians have considered 3 possibilities. He may have been dissatisfied with being hired out. Mrs. Emerson might have been planning to sell him, or he may have offered to buy his own freedom and had been refused. It is known that the suit was not brought for political reasons. It is thought that friends in St. Louis who opposed slavery had encouraged Scott to sue for his freedom on the grounds that he had once lived in a free territory. In the past, Missouri courts supported the doctrine of once free, always free. Because Scott lived under a system where it is illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or write, he was illiterate, and because his earnings were passed on to Mrs. Emerson, he had no funds, so he needed help with his suit. John Anderson, the Scots minister, may have been influential in their decision to sue, and the Blow family, Dred's original owners, backed him financially. The support of such friends helped the Scots through nearly 11 years of complex and often disappointing litigation. Among constitutional scholars, Scott v. Sandford is widely considered the worst decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court. It has been cited in particular as the most egregious example of the court's history of wrongly imposing a judicial solution on a political problem. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes famously characterized the decision as the court's great self-inflicted wound. Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney's opinion for the court was arguably the worst he had wrote. He ignored precedent, distorted history, and posed a rigid rather than a flexible construction on the Constitution, ignored specific grants of power in the Constitution, and tortured meanings out of the other more obscure clauses. His logic on the citizenship issue was perhaps the most convoluted. He admitted that African Americans could be citizens of a particular state and that they might even be able to vote, as they in fact did in some states, but he argued that state citizenship had nothing to do with national citizenship and that African Americans could not sue in federal court because they could not be citizens of the United States. Scott's suit, therefore, should have been dismissed for lack of jurisdiction by the district court. On this point, however, Taney stood on the shaky constitutional ground. If even one state considered an African American a citizen, then the Constitution required that all states, and by inference also the federal government, had to accord that person all privileges and immunities of citizens in several states, which included the right to sue in federal court. Furthermore, Article 3, which establishes the jurisdiction of federal courts, does not mention national citizenship, but rather declares that the judicial power shall extend, among other things, to controversies between citizens of different states, the so-called diversity jurisdiction. Even with this weak argument, Taney could have been accused of nothing worse than faulty reasoning if he had stopped there. If Scott was not a U.S. citizen, he could not sue in federal court, and the case would therefore not have been granted. But Taney was determined to impose a judicial solution on the slavery controversy. Although later courts would adopt the policy of deciding constitutional questions on the narrowest possible grounds, the pre-Civil War courts often decided all issues that could support their rulings. Thus, Taney continued, holding that Scott had never been free and that Congress had in fact exceeded its authority in the Missouri Compromise because it had no power to forbid or abolish slavery in the territories. The Missouri Compromise, which had served as the accepted constitutional settlement for nearly 4 decades, thus fell. Even the doctrine of popular sovereignty as articulated in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, whereby the people of each federal territory would have the power to decide whether the territory would enter the Union as a free or a slave state, lacked constitutional legitimacy according to Taney. He thus voided the principles of free soil, opposition to slavery in the territories and in newly admitted states, territorial sovereignty, and indeed every aspect of anti-slavery constitutional thought. For all practical purposes, Northern courts and politicians rejected Scott v. Sandford as binding. In an advisory opinion, Maine's High Court declared that African Americans could vote in both state and federal elections. The Ohio Supreme Court ruled that any slave coming into the state with his master's consent, even as a sojourner, became free and could not be re-enslaved upon returning to a slave state. The New York Court of Appeals handed down a similar ruling in Lemon v. People in 1860. In several states, legislatures resolved to prohibit slavery in any form from crossing onto their soil and enacted legislation freeing slaves passing within their borders. Taney is remembered now almost solely for the blatantly pro-slavery decision he wrote and for his demeaning comments about African Americans. When he died in 1864, he was roundly denounced and vilified in the North. Republican Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts predicted that the name of Taney is to be hooted down the page of history. Whatever else he may have done, his name will always be linked with that of a slave who wanted nothing more than his freedom. Dred Scott did, in fact, get his freedom, but not through courts. After he and his wife were later bought by the Blow family, who had sold Scott to Emerson in the first place, they were freed in 1857. Scott died of tuberculosis in St. Louis the following year. Harriet lived until June 1876, long enough to see the Civil War and the 13th Amendment of 1865, which abolished slavery in the United States. Thank you for staying to the end, and thank you for watching. What did you learn? Or was this just a reminder for you? Either way, I have more coming up. So have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, and I'll see you next week.